Hello everyone, we're very happy to be here presenting our project Look Around You, Situating Extended Reality within the Urban Fabric. I'm Carolina Ramirez Figueroa, Associate Professor at the Royal College of Arts, and with me is my colleague.
And I'm Campbell Orme, Product Design Lead at Meta Reality Labs Research.
We're very excited to share with you a project that explores extended reality outside the traditional boundaries of technology labs and into the heart of the city. We have structured the presentation in 4 parts. We have covering about why built environment, the opportunity that we came across, the project, and the design responses. So to begin with, when we think of XR, we often picture high-tech interfaces like headsets, holograms, digital overlays. And this current framing of XR usually prioritizes technical advancements. For instance, reducing friction in accessing content, enhancing convenience, streamlining interactions. Also in media, XR is frequently portrayed as a glowing digital boxes anchored to the physical world, which are often viewed from a detached third-person perspective. But this will often fail to address fundamental human needs. They provide tools without necessarily offering clear societal benefits or meaningful applications. And this narrow framing stops us from seeing the potential of XR to enrich human experiences and foster more inclusive and accessible interactions. So what happens when we design with purpose? When technology is developed not just for novelty, but for real impact? What if we reimagine XR beyond convenience? What if we consider its capacity to reshape engagement, connection, and participation? So we chose the built environment as the setting for this project because of its burst, ever-changing nature. And rather than seeing XR as an isolated technology intervention, we see it as a tool that can be embedded within the built environment to reveal its latent stories and deepen our connection to a place. The built environment also stands in contrast to the controlled settings of engineering or design studios, where XR applications are often conceived. It is a space that is shaped by both individual agency and also collective presence. As Italo Calvino reminds us, you take delight not in a city's 7 or 70 wonders, but in the answers it gives you to the question of yours. Whether through auditory, visual, or haptic modalities, XR application must be designed to extract meaningful, contextual, relevant insights from our environment to deepen our connection to the spaces we inhabit. We also wanted to move beyond the assumption that XR must always be screen-based, and instead ask, how can XR enhance human experience in ways that are intuitive, inclusive, and deeply connected to a place? So to do this, we worked with a group of 30 postgraduate students from the MA in Information Experience Design at the RCA, who had no prior experience in working with XR, and we encouraged them to explore speculative, low-tech, screen-free prototypes grounded in real-world behaviors. And instead of designing in a lab, we took them into streets of London. Our challenge was twofold. First, how do we ensure that XR interventions respond to real human behaviors rather than being driven by technology novelty? And second, how do we shift the design process away from the constraints of digital screens and into something more embedded, more spatial, and more participatory? Our approach prioritized site-specific. First, to encourage direct observation of human behavior, so engaging within the site as active spaces rather than abstract design problems. Second, to avoid the pitfalls of generic converged vision design, where technologies are conceived without grounding in a place or a purpose. We selected 6 sites within the City of London. The locations were chosen within walking distance of one another. So the 6 locations include, going from top left, Christchurch Greyfriars, once a Grand Range Church, and now it's a public garden. Next, we have Paternoster Square. This area hosts the relocated Temple Bargate, and it blends architectural heritage with contemporary urban activities. Then we have St. Paul's Cathedral, which is an iconic landmark at the heart of London's medieval landscape. From there, we moved to the Millennium Bridge, which is often described as a blade of light cutting across the Thames. And further along the river, we arrived at Bankside Pier, which is a key transport hub where boats and passengers constantly come and go. And finally, we have Tate Modern, which is a former industrial power station, which is now being transformed into a world-renowned cultural institution. So these 6 locations became the site for our exploration. Students were organized within 6 groups, each group tackling one of the sites, and the project then unfolded into 2 phases. First, an open-end exploration, gathering observations, mapping behaviors, and engaging with the city spaces. And then a refinement phase, focusing on a single site-specific design proposal. And on the first phase, the students documented the findings on a mirror board that acted as a centralized source of truth, allowing students to reflect on each other's observation and also build a shared understanding of how people engage within these environments. Students were introduced to ideation techniques like affinity mapping, value canvases, and structured voting to support the design process, helping them to refine their concepts. We encourage the students to embrace low-fidelity prototyping, focusing on ideas rather than technical execution. Each student was given a sheet of acetate and a marker to start sketching views over the environment, to visualize XR interventions without the constraints of coding of software limitations. Narrative and storytelling were also very important. And instead of predefined solutions, students developed speculative scenarios, imagining how XR might shape future interactions in their assigned sites.
So let's take a look at the design responses. Remember, we were within this brief about keeping things low tech. So we didn't want our students to be spending weeks in Unity. This was about analyzing each specific site and observing those human actions, those human behaviors that were taking place there. The theme that our first group latched onto was about revealing invisible histories. The location that they had was the Greyfriars Church. So there's a very small percentage left of what was a very large medieval site that was around there. They were curious about people visiting that space. What would it mean for them to be able to find the fabric of the architecture that was in there? What they were looking at was essentially distributed computing. They were the only group that we had that were looking at faking like extra bits of hardware. So they had this curious little leatherette band with a little bead on it that was supposed to be faking a haptic transponder. So as you were moving through the space, you were able to feel what was there. Carolina spoke about narrative as well. This group were great about being inclusive with demonstrating what the experience could be to the rest of the group. So they had a whole bunch of iPads, we had QR codes so that we could trigger the content and so on. Our next group here, so when they went out to the site, they saw a whole load of lunchtime workers that were killing time by doom scrolling on their phones. So it was like, aha, okay, our theme is around urban play within this space. The location that they had was Paternoster Square, and they quite literally had a totem that they could anchor their experience onto, which is this large chimney, which is actually an exhaust from the car park that sits underneath it. The group here were imagining a kind of community-based group, kind of Beat Saber type game, where the central hub was the tower, the totem that sits within Paternoster Square. And you might be able to play against people who are already in the space, or you could play against yourself in a kind of like ghost car format, as if you were there from lunch the previous week. They were also at one point imagining like the pigeons might be this interfering element as they sort of come in. They might disrupt your score. So it's really about, again, designing for the space here. Over to our next group, they were interested in spectacle. So if we go to St. Paul's Cathedral, their site today, it's all about tourists taking cameras out and looking about the space and recording and putting down like videos and photos and things like that. But they weren't interested in the tourists. They were interested in the non-human ecologies and the migratory patterns of the birds that were flocking around the tower of St. Paul's. And as this group were recording this and watching this and observing this, they thought, but what if I wasn't here at this point in time and I wanted to re-experience that? How might somebody be able to stand in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral and see the birds flocking around there at sunset, but it's only at midday? So this notion of scrubbing time, I think, is something that's particularly powerful around XR, and we'll come back to that within our conclusions. The next group here, they were one of the few groups to really lean into the non-visual aspect of it. We talked a little bit about haptics in the first response. The response that we saw here was all about audio. So they weren't mocking up visuals for, hey, what might be hovering in front of your eyes. They were interested in what might be piped through your headphones as you're moving across the Millennium Bridge. They took the Millennium Bridge, they blew up its scale, and they essentially put together this proposal for turning it into a MIDI sequencer. So as you walk across the Millennium Bridge, your presence, your footsteps, your personal history through that space is going to trigger different audio archives and different music as you move to it. They also imagined people being able to contribute to this, or to take away these MIDI files that have been created on a piece of architecture and remix and jam with those. Over to our penultimate group here. The theme that they came up with here was around literature and generative pieces of communication. And not surprisingly, the site that they had here was directly opposite from the Globe Theatre, or the reconstructed Globe Theatre from the 80s. So taking that rich history of playwrights, of poetry and narrative, they looked upon the Thames and imagined this as the canvas that people might be able to put down generative poetry. They were putting together prototypes using Snap Lens Studio, which is great because you've got ground anchors there. And then they went one step further and said, well, what if you don't have a phone? If we're going to be inclusive with this, well, maybe there are some binoculars that are situated along the span of the Thames, and I can start to see this word poetry evolve with the ebb and flow of the Thames River. And last, no means least, our final theme is around spatial archiving. So our group here took on the Tate Modern, and specifically the Turbine Hall, which is host to a number of site-specific art installations that are rolled out across the years. But what if you weren't there to see these fantastic constructions that were there? The art still exists. It might be in boxes in an archive, but how might XR play a role in letting people re-experience that site-specific piece of artwork? They then took another layer onto it and started to think of a service design element. It was like, well, what's stopping you from archiving through XR every single piece of artwork that has passed through the Tate Modern, and you can experience it as if you were walking through that building again?
Through our research, 3 key themes emerge in how XR can shape and be shaped by public spaces. These themes are location, living content, and experience base. Within location, one of the key aspects is geofencing, the use of physical boundaries to trigger digital content. So all of the design responses in this project were site-specific, but the students also considered the movement of visitors. So how does an XR experience transition when someone approaches or leaves a site? Successful interventions were those that reimagined fluid and adaptable, enhancing the sense of place rather than disturbing the natural flow. Another crucial factor is shared spaces. We saw this in 3 projects: projection map gaming at the Paternoster Square, generative soundscapes at the Millennium Bridge, and AI-generated poetry on the Thames. Each created an experience that multiple people could engage with simultaneously. And this challenges the conventional notion of XR as an isolated individual activity, and instead shifting towards multi-user shared interactions. Permanence, the idea that XR doesn't have to be ephemeral. So the Tech Modern project proposed an XR layer that could preserve historical and cultural moments. This raised an important question: can XR be as site-specific and enduring as any physical intervention in the built environment? And if so, it could become a tool for long-term engagement with history, memory, and place. Under the next theme, living content, so how XR evolves over time and adapts to users. So a key challenge with traditional mobile AR is that it is often a one-off experience. So successful proposals in this project encourage repeat engagement. Another key insight was that XR doesn't have to be purely visual. So many assume XR means floating 3D objects, but half of the projects focus on sound instead. And finally, XR should not be static. So advances in AI means that XR can be generative and community-driven. So we can imagine, for instance, an XR layer that evolves based on public participation. So for instance, a user-generated art or community-driven storytelling. And the final theme is experience-based, so how XR encases our perception of place. So one major strength of XR is its ability to reveal the unseen and add layers of meaning to space. So closely linked to this is reliving and re-experiencing. So XR can bring the past back to life, whether this is through historical reenactments or revisiting moments tied to specific place. Finally, we saw that XR is adaptable. So while all 6 projects were designed for specific locations, the core mechanics were flexible enough to be applied somewhere else. So to summarize, the project demonstrated that XR can be deeply contextual and responsive to specificities of a place and a human activity, and also has the potential to transform urban and historical spaces. XR development should focus on everyday applications that meet real human needs, rather than speculative leaps disconnected from lived realities, and that the built environment is a fertile ground for such applications. It also demonstrated that XR immersive qualities are difficult to capture in static formats. And in the future, we would like to explore more dynamic prototyping and broader urban scale interactions. And it finally showed that XR, when it's rooted in real world context, offers a powerful way to engage with and reshape our surroundings. So thank you very much for listening, and we're open for any questions that you might have.